Hello, welcome to History Detectives Grand Rapids. Today, you're going to hear a presentation. Before Jerry and Betty, there was another prominent Ford couple in Grand Rapids, and that was Joe Ford and Emma Ford. My name is Christine Byron, and I'm going to be talking about Joe Ford. Sophia Ward Brewer is going to be talking about Emma Ford. Our program is co-sponsored by the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council, the Grand Rapids Historical Commission, and the Grand Rapids African American Museum and Archives. And now I'm going to share my screen. Joseph C. Ford. He was also known as Senator Ford, and I'll explain that in a bit. He was born about 1851 or 1852. He's not really sure of the year of his birth. He was enslaved as a youth at the Alsop Plantation in Spotsylvania, Virginia, near Fredericksburg, and he was just a young boy about 10 years old when the Civil War broke out. He remembers holding the reins of General Stonewall Jackson's horse, Sorrel, at the plantation where he was born, and which later became Jackson's headquarters for a time during the Civil War. Ford served in the Confederate Army as a valet to his master and as a personal attendant to several different men in the 30th Virginia Infantry. He also served in the commissary. Ford had a marvelous memory, and combined with his knowledge of Southern topography, he became something of an authority on Civil War battlefields. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Fredericksburg battlefields were close to the Alsop Plantation, and he may have acquired knowledge of these firsthand while he served in the Confederacy. He came to Grand Rapids about 1872. We're not really sure why Grand Rapids and how he got here. But when he first came, he lived in a series of boarding houses and worked at various jobs until he was hired by the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. He also worked as a keeper of the Michigan Senate cloakroom, and I'm going to be talking about those two career paths that he took. Sophia will talk a little bit more about his family life and his wife and his children. In 1874, Ford was given a job by William Ugart, president of the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. He first worked as a messenger in the general office of the GR&I and later in the parlor car service. He was regarded as the best and most popular parlor car conductor on the GR&I line between Grand Rapids and Mackinac City. In 1888, a passenger could leave Grand Rapids at 11:30 a.m. and arrive in Mackinac City by 9:30 p.m. That would be a long time for a porter to serve his passengers. Mothers reportedly warned their children prior to the resort season that if they didn't behave, they wouldn't be allowed to go north on Senator Joe Ford's train. When the new Union Station opened in Grand Rapids in 1900, Ford was made chief porter. By 1921, the Grand Rapids and Indiana line was fully merged with the Pennsylvania line. Ford served the railroad for 48 years until he was pensioned in 1921. Porters had one of the best jobs in the African American community, putting them on a social par with teachers, funeral directors, and even doctors and lawyers. They had rules and regulations to follow. They were always required to be civil and gentlemanly. They could not tolerate any rudeness, and they were required to answer all inquiries properly. When Governor Fred Greene was a young boy in Cadillac, his parents entrusted him to Ford's care on an otherwise unsupervised trip to Grand Rapids. And lo and behold, 1927, when this young man, Fred Greene, becomes governor, he had more encounters with Joe Ford. This is a tragic story that was covered in the Grand Rapids Press. In 1909, a man was sent from the asylum in Traverse City, dying of tuberculosis, to his home in Hubbardsville, but he died at Union Station in Joe Ford's arms. What a terrible, tragic story. Porters really had some unexpected duties that they just had to step in and do. And Joe Ford was really popular. A lot of people knew him. And when the Lundquist store opened across from Union Station, they used a drawing of Joe Ford to advertise. Let me give you a tip where you can save money, Joe Ford is saying. Well, Joe Ford asked $5,000 for the use of his picture. He felt that the company made business from his using his picture in advertising, and then he was deserving a share. But as far as I can tell, nothing ever happened with this. In the days before Social Security, Ford took a position in 1923 as a doorman with the newly built Morton House on Monroe Avenue in downtown Grand Rapids. The new Morton House replaced the old structure with a fireproof 430-room building on the same site. The Grand Rapids Herald in 1923 wrote that the new Morton certainly is going to present one familiar figure to travelers, and that figure is Joe Ford. Everybody that lives in Grand Rapids or has come through here for the past quarter of a century or more knows Joe from his service at Union Station. Well, his other career was in the Michigan Senate. Joe Ford was first appointed as Keeper of the Michigan Senate Cloakroom in January 1881. The position was a political appointment, and since Ford was active in Republican circles, he easily garnered support for the post. 1881 happened to be only the second session ever held in the present state capitol. And 1881 was also the year that Joe Ford married Emma Warren. When Joe returned to duty at the Capitol a few days after his April wedding, he found an elegant set of dinner china laid out on a table in the cloakroom. The gift was presented to him with best wishes by the Michigan senators. And here's a diagram of the Senate chamber. And the cloakroom was a sort of private space adjoining the Senate chamber. Ford would have been responsible for keeping it stocked with items that the Senate requested, everything from coffee and tea to cigars and booze. The men's restroom adjoined the cloakroom, and Ford was likely responsible for keeping that stocked as well. This is the 1881 roster of Michigan senators. And when Ford started in the cloakroom, the senators did not have offices yet and would have kept their coats, hats, satchels, traveling bags, and other items entrusted to Ford's care. The senators may have relied on Ford from everything to arranging local errands to a quick brush of a coat before stepping on the Senate floor. He also, at times, served as a messenger and page for the Senate. Here is a photo of the members of the Senate in 1885, and we think that is Joe in the right-hand side, standing in the doorway. Here's a photo of the Grand Hall leading to the Senate chamber. If you haven't had a tour of the state capitol, it's something you really should do. It's a remarkable building. Here's a photo from 1899 showing the Senate chamber. Ford was only absent from 3 sessions of the legislature in all his years of service. The Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad gave him a leave of absence when the Senate was in session. And speaking with a railroad historian, I learned that that would have been extremely rare that they would have given a leave of absence. This is a photo from 1931 showing the back of the Senate chamber, and there's a man in a white coat entering the cloakroom, and that could very well be Joe Ford, because he was keeper in 1931. Earning the nickname Senator, Ford continued to serve at various sessions of the Michigan Senate, although not always continuous, for many years. Ford met and developed relationships with many of Michigan's leading statesmen from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Ford was in his glory when he retraced the political careers of various Michigan politicians. He loved to tell the story of fellow Grand Rapidian William Alden Smith's first job in the Michigan Senate in 1907. Not all of Ford's friends were Republicans. Woodbridge Ferris, a Democrat, held Ford in high esteem and sent him as a delegate to convention conferences. This is an article from the Lansing State Journal from 1931 saying for the 14th time, Senator Joe Ford escorted a governor of Michigan to the annual chicken dinner at the AME Church in Lansing. And here are the 14 governors he would have escorted through 1931, with Wilbur Bruckner being the most recent at that point. Also in 1931, the Journal of the Senate recorded that during the recess on April 29th, Mr. Joseph C. Ford was escorted to the platform, and Senator Conlin, on behalf of the senators, presented him with a fine mahogany clock in appreciation of his long years of faithful service as an employee in the Senate. A few years later, in 1931, a resolution was passed stating that to honor J.C. Ford for his years of ardent and genuine service rendered by this loyal and patriotic citizen, and he was highly respected by the Senate members. And as I mentioned earlier, he was involved in the Republican Party. So appreciated was the work that Ford provided the Senate that he was called upon almost every 4 years by the Michigan Republican Party to attend their national convention, serving the Michigan delegates as their major domo or chief steward, and taking care of their headquarters. Ford was first appointed to attend the 1884 Republican National Convention in Chicago and continued attending at least 12 conventions through 1933. He had been taking care of the Michigan delegation's comfort for so long that he became a fixture, and the convention would be incomplete without his broadly smiling presence. In political circles, Ford met many prominent men of the day. Ford became acquainted with Presidents William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, as well as other prominent political figures like William Jennings Bryan. This is a story from 1912 when Ford first met Woodrow Wilson. A friend of Ford's, Aldrich Blake, had arranged for a campaign stop in Grand Rapids when Wilson was running for the president. When Wilson arrived at Union Station, introductions were made, and Ford reached for Wilson's 2 suitcases and a bag, but Wilson demurred, saying that they were too heavy for one man. Ford replied that, "I am used to carrying the white man's burden." Wilson, a Kipling devotee, smiled at the reference to Kipling's poem. 5 years later, in 1917, Ford was in Washington, and another friend of Ford's introduced Wilson to the senator from Michigan. Wilson looked at Ford, smiled, and quickly replied, "I remember him. He carries the white man's burden." Now, besides being involved in the Republican Party, he was an activist in other circles. He was a high official in the Michigan chapter of the Negro Knights Templar. In 1887, at the Grand Conclave in the local armory, Ford was the master of toasts for the evening's speeches and entertainment. He continued to be active in the Colored Masons for many years and led an effort in 1914 to raise money for a permanent lodge and club rooms for the North Star Negro Masonic Lodge. Ford was vice president of the Equal Rights League of Kent County, and under his leadership, a local men's group supported a resolution in favor of women's suffrage in 1899. And that was the year that the National Women's Suffrage Convention was here in Grand Rapids. He also served on a committee of the State Equals Rights Association in 1893. Another example of his activism was that in 1910, Ford visited the county clerk to protest the enactment of the proposed law making illegal for interracial marriages. Joe Ford, an advocate for better training for African American children, was appointed by Governor Ferris as one of the Michigan delegates to the Negro National Educational Convention in Kansas City in 1913, as well as the following year in Oklahoma City. In 1915, Joe Ford headed a delegation of more than 40 prominent Black citizens to protest the film, The Birth of a Nation, when he learned it was coming to Grand Rapids in February. He became involved with the Grand Rapids chapter of the NAACP when it was founded here in 1919, and he attended the National Convention in Denver in 1925. Besides knowing U.S. presidents, Michigan governors, and various other Michigan politicians, Joe also knew many of the local Black notable figures. He knew Floyd Skinner from his work with the Progressive Voters League and the NAACP. He knew J.C. Craig from his association with the Colored Knights Templar. Now, he was well known in Grand Rapids and Lansing, but he was also well known in Idlewild. Senator Joe Ford was elected mayor of Idlewild in 1916 in an informal election. Idlewild was not a government municipality at that point. His opponent was E.F. Mosley, an attorney from Chicago. Ford was well known in the Idlewild community, and he won out handsomely. It is through Joe that Idlewild has become notable, and through Senator Joe and his active brethren that the resort has made such substantial progress. Senator Joe is proud of his title, and justly so, and he is proud of Idlewild, the Herald wrote in 1916. As far back as 1912, Joe Ford was known for bringing large crowds of Grand Rapids African Americans to Idlewild on Grand Rapids Day. He also was very involved in the Grand Rapids Idlewild Club and hosted meetings in his home. Joe knew Dr. Eugene Browning, both from Grand Rapids and Idlewild, where they both vacationed. In 1908, Ford had supported Dr. Browning when he was considered for the position of city physician by the Board of Health, but was unsuccessful in that effort. Governor Greene and his wife visited Idlewild in August of 1929, and I'm sure Joe was behind the scenes for arranging this visit and some others. A few years later, in 1923, Governor Wilbur Brucker came to Idlewild, and I bet Joe was behind that as well. Since his retirement from the Pennsylvania Railroad, Ford had a lifetime pass for his family that was good all over the Pennsylvania line. He and Emma traveled quite a bit, visiting his birthplace in Virginia and other southern points of interest. Joseph Ford passed away on January 17, 1939, far from Grand Rapids, a city that had been his home for some 65 years. He died at the home of his daughter-in-law, Mrs. Chandler Ford, in New York City. His presumed age was 87 years. Upon his death, the Grand Rapids Herald noted that through his work as a porter, a Michigan Senate cloakroom keeper, and political servant, Senator Joe Ford was one of the state's most widely known citizens. He is buried in Oak Hill Cemetery beside his wife Emma and very near their children, Chandler and Theola. And now we're going to move on to Sophia Ward Brewer, who's going to be talking about Emma Ford.
Chris, thank you so much for introducing us to Joe Ford. As you all can see, Joe Ford was smart, he was kind, he was courageous, and he was charming. So you may be wondering what his wife, Emma, was like. Well, I'm here to tell you she was just as smart, just as kind, just as courageous, and she seemed to be very likable. So now I want to introduce you to Emma Ford. This is Emma Ford. I actually believe that by the end of our presentation, you might feel that she was someone remarkable. At the very least, you're going to know that she was special. Emma was born Emma Stella Warren in Ontario, Canada in January of 1861. Emma's parents were Joseph and Sarah Warren. Joseph Warren, Emma's father, was a black man, and we really don't know much about him. We do know that in 1859, he worked as a farmhand for the Judson family in Pontiac, Michigan. Emma's mother, maiden name Sarah Judson, was a heiress to a wealthy family in Pontiac, Michigan. Sarah's parents were Alfred and Louisa Judson, and they were a wealthy family who operated a farm in Pontiac. And Sarah had several siblings. Sarah Judson eloped with Joseph Warren, the black farmhand, in 1859. Now, this is before the Civil War, several years before the Civil War. This was beyond taboo at the time. In many states, it was illegal. The story of Joseph and Sarah elopement made national news. Actually, it made international news. As you can see on this slide, they covered it everywhere from Alabama to Chicago, in England, and it was even covered in Ireland and Australia. This elopement was a news sensation. So there's a long story behind this elopement. Sarah's brother and father actually went and found her after she eloped the first time, brought her back home. She got an annulment. And so this is one of the articles that cover her elopement the second time. I'm going to read it to you. Married a second time, the Judson white girl, whose elopement from Pontiac, Michigan, with the Negro Joe, sometime since caused considerable talk, is now in Canada, living with him, having again deserted her home and friends. On the occasion of her former elopement, her father and brother reclaimed her with great difficulty and took her to Indiana, where a divorce was obtained. I don't know why they had to go to Indiana to get a divorce. It continues. She went home with them and remained until last week, when she again left with or without consent of her parents and came to Detroit. Crossing the river, she found Joe, and they were speedily married for the second time and are now living the enjoyment of connubial happiness. So this story was big news in 1859. Their elopement remained a news sensation for quite a few years. This article about their elopement and their having kids now was published in the Plain Dealer in 1861. Emma's parents, Sarah and Joseph Warren, had 6 children. Emma, Frances, Louisa and William were twins, Charles and Harry. The 1870 census shows that Emma's parents and 4 of her siblings, Charles and Harry wasn't born yet, lived in Saginaw in 1870. So I believe that Emma got most of her education when they were living in Saginaw. However, they did move, and we'll see that in a moment. So I wanted to show you a picture of Emma and her mother side by side. So this is Sarah Judson on the left-hand side of the screen and Emma on the right-hand side of the screen. I know Emma's photo is grainy here, but you can see the resemblance though. So I want to talk a little bit about Emma and Joe Ford's marriage. Emma and Joe got married on April 14, 1881. And here is their marriage license. And they were married in Windsor, Ontario. Here's the family tree for Emma and Joe. They had 2 children, Chandler Lee Ford and Theola S. Ford. So Joe and Emma's first child was Chandler Lee Ford. Joe had to be a charismatic person because he knew lots of senators based on his job, and they seemed to like him really well. And he seemed to like them. In this case, Chandler Lee Ford is named after 2 senators whom Joe was apparently very fond of. Senator Joe Chandler from Lake Superior and A.S. Lee of Petoskey. These 2 articles show that both of the senators were fine with Joe naming his son after them. In fact, both of the senators were reported to have set aside land for Chandler Lee when he got older. I did some looking around and I really didn't see any other evidence of it other than what was reported in the papers. So Chandler Lee Ford was born in 1883 and he went to school, and I saw that he went to engineering school. But Chandler later became a musician and he moved to New York, where he got married, and he had 1 child, a girl, and he named her Theola or Theolia. It's unfortunate, but he died when he was 32 years old in 1916. Emma and Joe's second child was a girl, and her name was Theola or Theolia S. Ford. Theola became the second African American to teach in Grand Rapids Public Schools, or the second African American woman for sure to teach in Grand Rapids Public Schools. Hattie Beverly was the first, and she started teaching in 1899. Theola got married to a prominent doctor named J.R. Phelan. She met him in Idlewild, Michigan, and newspapers reported on their marriage, but they also reported on their divorce. I guess her husband was somewhat of a gigolo, her first husband, J.R. Phelan, and he was quite popular in Idlewild. When she got a divorce, her uncle, Francis Warren, who was her lawyer. So she got a divorce in 1922 from the doctor from Ohio. And then she married another man, Adworth Lewis, who was from Chicago. She later moved to Chicago, and I think she taught in Chicago for a while. Then she died in Chicago in 1938, 1 year after her mother died. Her mother died in 1937. Theola was 47 years old when she passed away. I also wanted to show you a picture of Theola and her mother side by side. So this picture of Theola was probably taken around the turn of the 20th century, so between 1900 and 1902 or 03. And the same with that picture of Emma. These pictures were probably taken in Petoskey or on Mackinac Island. So where did they live? From 1884 to about 1891, the Fords lived at 438 LaGrave Avenue. And then from about 1892 to 1894, they lived at 438 LaGrave Avenue. They lived for a while on Lafayette, and then they lived for quite a while at 550 Jefferson. They lived there from about 1896 to 1924. Could not locate a photo of that home. Then from about 1925 until Joe's death, and he died in 1939, as Chris stated, they lived at 1139 Thomas Street. Now, Joe and Emma were certainly a power couple back then. News of their 50th wedding anniversary was published in several newspapers. It was reported in Indiana, it was reported in Detroit, and this is an article that was reported in the Grand Rapids Press in 1931. So, to give you a little insight into what their marriage must have been like and what their work life must have been like, I pulled this article from the Grand Rapids Press, but the source for the Grand Rapids Press was the Petoskey Resorter, which often wrote about Emma Ford. And so, this is what their life would have been like in 1893. The Petoskey Resorter has this to say of a well-known young colored man of this city, who is also well known at Lansing every legislative year. If there is anyone in Mackinac Island who is chock full of business, it is Joe Ford, or Senator, as he is best known, and his wife. They run the best restaurant on the island. That is, Mrs. Ford runs it, while the senator is doing routine work at the best and most popular Wagner Parlor car conductor on the GR&I, which stands for the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad line, with route between Grand Rapids and Mackinac City. Just on the side, and to keep him out of mischief, when on the Grand Rapids end of his route, Joe does real estate business. He has a few houses and lots that help him to keep the wolf a long distance from the door. With his back towards the house, Mrs. Ford doesn't need a bit of help to keep the restaurant business on the boom, even when the senator is away. And there is always a lively air of business about the popular dining parlors. So they were busy people, but from what I can gather, they also had a great sense of humor and a great relationship with each other. So this is another article that talks about Emma, specifically talking about her restaurant. This article was reported in the Petoskey Daily Resorter on August 19, 1901. And it talks about Emma Ford being quite the businesswoman, quite the caterer. They mentions that she was a superintendent for the WCTU, which was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. She was a delegate for several women's clubs and traveled a lot as a delegate for those clubs. So she was well liked, she was well formed, she was well informed, she was well traveled. It also talks about her being a fixture on the island, and that she had been there for 11 seasons. So 11 seasons meaning 11 years, and this is 1901. It said that Mrs. Ford was not only had three divisions of her business. It was a restaurant, it was a catering business, and it was a bakery. And it talked about the fact that she had 17 employees that she employed during the summer. And a lot of them traveled from Grand Rapids or Chicago to come up to Mackinac Island to work for Miss Ford. So this is a photo of Emma in front of her restaurant at Mackinac Island. So I wanted to kind of zoom in on her face a little bit so that you can see her a little bit more clearly. And I also wanted to zoom in on the horse carriage, which says "Ford the Caterer." So this wasn't just some small business at this particular time. This was business for Mackinac Island and big business for Emma Ford. So these are several different articles where she had advertised in the Petoskey Resorter or the Daily Resorter. I also know that she later expanded her catering business to Grand Rapids as well. So Emma Ford was truly involved in WCTU work. That's the Women's Christian Temperance Union work, which was founded in 1874 by Frances Willard. And I wanted to kind of show you some of the people that I believe that Emma Ford was on par with. So there is the first person, which was Amanda Berry Smith. And then Lucy Thurman and Emma Ford were really good friends. I think Lucy is the one that kind of got her involved in the WCTU. And the WCTU was really like a training ground for them. I really believe they learned to speak and do lectures in the WCTU. They often had to present their work in the WCTU. So I think that was a way for the way that these women grew and became more popular because they traveled around the country as part of their work with the WCTU. The purpose of the WCTU was to educate all people with the help of God to total abstinence from alcohol, illegal drugs, and tobacco as a way of life. So here's one of Emma's annual reports for the WCTU in 1838. Emma ends this report with this summary. Trusting there is a little encouragement in this report, I submit the above. I have distributed 240 pages of temperance literature, have given 10 temperance talks, organized 2 unions known as the Haviland Union in Kalamazoo and the Sojourner Truth Union in Lansing. Emma was extremely active in church. So these are some of her church activity. She was first a member of the Spring Street AME Church, and then she became a member of the AME Zion Church. Emma worked with many social clubs. She was a founding member of the Married Ladies 19th Century Club. She was also a Eastern Star, and Joe was a Mason. And so they had that work that they were doing. Emma's work with clubs like this one, the Phyllis Weekly Club, provided her with the opportunity or responsibility to also address issues like discrimination that came up during that time. This article talks about an incident in which their daughter went to a theater and was forced out of their seat, even though she had paid for a seat, was forced out of the seat because the theater was overcrowded. So the Black people at the time would have to leave if there were more white people than the seating would allow. Emma is writing a resolution that she wants to send to the manager of the theater, and the resolution reads, "Be it resolved that we, the Phyllis Weekly Circle, protest against this discrimination and that we be accorded the rights of all citizens which is given by the laws of Michigan." Emma was well connected. Here is an address book for Mary Church Terrell in which she has Emma Ford's name and address listed. In 1907, there was a State Federation of Colored Clubs convention here in Grand Rapids, and Emma Ford was the chairman for the committee who organized the convention. And her long-term friend, Miss Lucy Thurman, was president of the National Association for Colored Women's Clubs at the time. Emma at the time was a founding member or president of 3 of the clubs that were associated here in Grand Rapids with the National Association for Women's Clubs. So Emma was a sought-after speaker and leader. In 1913, she was named as a delegate to the Emancipation Proclamation anniversary in New York. And this is a flyer for the exposition at that particular time. She was named as a delegate by Governor Ferris. So Emma was a successful woman. She died in Chicago while visiting her daughter in 1937, and she is buried alongside of her husband here in Grand Rapids.